What happens when a friendly chat about raising kids turns into the most explosive and shocking meltdown ever seen on daytime television? In just 30 seconds, beloved actor Tony Robinson went from smiling guest to furiously storming off the Loose Women set after an absolutely brutal and fiery clash with Denise Welch that left the entire studio in total shock and the audience gasping in disbelief. Before we dive into this unbelievable drama that has everyone talking, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now for daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals and the explosive confrontations that happen when celebrities let their guards down. Trust me, you won't want to miss what we uncover next. Last night's episode of Loose Women was supposed to be a lighthearted, fun discussion about modern parenting and finding that perfect work-life balance that so many people struggle with. Tony Robinson, the absolutely beloved actor that everyone knows from his legendary years on Blackadder and his fascinating work on Time Team, joined the panel as a special guest to share his honest thoughts and experiences about raising children while living in the public spotlight. The producers thought it would be a sweet, feel-good segment that viewers would love. What absolutely nobody in that studio could have predicted was that this seemingly innocent conversation would spiral completely out of control and turn into one of the most uncomfortable, cringeworthy, and jaw-dropping moments ever broadcast on daytime television. The show started off friendly enough, exactly how these daytime talk shows always begin. The bright studio lights were shining, the audience was clapping enthusiastically, and the panel welcomed Tony with those warm, professional smiles that television hosts are so good at. Denise Welch, sitting at the far end of the curved desk, looking confident and ready to engage, seemed particularly excited and eager to have him on the show. She was practically bouncing in her seat with anticipation. She kicked things off by asking Tony about his personal experience as a father, and specifically how he managed to keep his kids grounded and normal despite living with the pressures and temptations of his considerable fame. It seemed like such a soft, easy question to start with. The kind of question that guests love because it lets them tell sweet stories about their children. Tony smiled warmly, his eyes lighting up with genuine affection, and began sharing a touching story about his son's recent graduation from university. He talked passionately about the importance of letting children make their own choices and discoveries, about not forcing them down a particular path just because it's what you want for them. He emphasized how crucial it is to respect their independence and let them become their own people. The other panelists nodded along enthusiastically, clearly enjoying his relaxed storytelling style and his obvious love for his family. Several of them smiled and made small agreeing sounds. Everything seemed perfectly normal, comfortable, and pleasant. But then something shifted in the air. Denise suddenly jumped in with a question that immediately changed the entire temperature in the room. You could literally see the atmosphere transform in seconds. She brought up an old interview Tony had done years and years ago, digging deep into his past, where he mentioned that he believed children should be allowed to fail sometimes, that parents shouldn't always rush in to save them from every single mistake or consequence. She leaned forward intensely and asked him directly, with a slight edge in her voice, if he still felt that way after all these years. Tony, still trying to keep things light and friendly, confirmed that yes, he absolutely still believed in that parenting philosophy. He hadn't changed his mind at all. He explained carefully that letting kids experience natural consequences, within reason of course, helps them learn crucial resilience and important problem-solving skills that they'll need throughout their entire lives. It was a completely reasonable answer, one that many respected parenting experts and child psychologists would actually agree with. Nothing controversial at all, really. But Denise's face tightened visibly. Her smile faded completely, and her expression hardened. She leaned even further forward across the desk, invading his space a bit, and said quite bluntly that she personally found that approach quite harsh and possibly even damaging to children. She talked about her own sons and how she always made absolutely sure they knew without any doubt that she had their backs no matter what happened, no matter what mistakes they made. The way she said it carried a definite edge, sharp and pointed, like she was directly suggesting that Tony's approach was somehow wrong, uncaring, or even cruel. Tony's warm smile faded significantly. His shoulders tensed up, and you could see his jaw tighten just slightly. He took a measured breath and calmly replied, trying very hard to keep his composure, that having your kids' backs and supporting them doesn't mean protecting them from every single consequence that comes their way. He said, with deliberate emphasis on each word, that there's a very important difference between genuine support and unhealthy enabling, and that sometimes, difficult as it may be, the most truly loving thing a parent can actually do is step back and let their child learn from their own mistakes and missteps. The other panelists, sensing the growing tension crackling between Tony and Denise, tried desperately to lighten the increasingly heavy mood. One of them made a somewhat awkward joke about how all parents constantly question their choices and worry if they're doing the right thing. A few people in the audience laughed nervously, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading. But Denise wasn't letting it go. Not even close. She wasn't interested in moving on or diffusing the situation. She pressed further, her voice getting sharper and more aggressive, asking Tony point blank if he genuinely thought that parents who are more protective and hands-on are somehow doing it wrong. If he was actually judging other parents for caring too much. Her tone was becoming noticeably more hostile and confrontational with each word that came out of her mouth. The studio was getting uncomfortable. You could feel it. Tony shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his body language screaming that he wanted to be anywhere but there. He clarified firmly, trying one more time to be reasonable, that he never once said protective parents were doing it wrong or making mistakes. He emphasized that there are simply different parenting styles and approaches, and his personal style happens to involve giving his kids more independence and freedom to make their own choices. He very deliberately emphasized the word different multiple times, like he was desperately trying to remind Denise that not everyone has to parent exactly the same way, that there's room for various approaches. But Denise absolutely wasn't having it. Not one bit. She brought up something even more personal, digging deeper into his private life. She mentioned a specific incident from several years ago, something that had probably been difficult for Tony's family at the time. About Tony's son getting into some trouble at school for something relatively minor. She brought up how Tony's response at the time was apparently to let his son face the consequences himself rather than immediately jumping to his defense and trying to fix everything. She asked him point blank, staring directly into his eyes, if he actually regretted handling it that way, if he wished he'd done things differently. The entire studio got very, very quiet. You could have heard a pin drop. The audience stopped fidgeting. The other panelists froze. Everyone was watching to see how Tony would respond to such a direct, personal attack on his parenting choices. Tony's jaw visibly clenched. His hands gripped the arms of his chair tightly, knuckles going white. He took a deep, deliberate breath, clearly trying to control his rising anger, and said firmly and clearly that no, he absolutely didn't regret it one bit, because his son learned a really important lesson from that experience that has served him well in life. Then he added, with barely contained frustration, that he found it quite interesting and somewhat disturbing that Denise had apparently been keeping such close tabs on his personal family matters from years ago, storing them away to bring up at moments like this. That comment hit a very sensitive nerve. Denise's eyes flashed with anger, her face flushed red, and she shot back immediately, her voice rising, that she remembers it specifically because it was plastered all over the press at the time, and she found it absolutely shocking and disturbing that a parent would leave their child to deal with something so difficult, completely alone. She said the word shocking with real heavy emphasis, drawing it out like she simply couldn't believe any decent parent would ever do such a thing. Like Tony was some kind of monster. Tony's voice rose slightly in response, his famous calm demeanor finally starting to crack. He said, with frustration clearly bleeding through, that his son wasn't alone at all, that there's a huge and important difference between being present and supportive in the background versus fighting all of your kids' battles for them and never letting them experience any hardship. He looked directly at Denise, making intense eye contact, and said with pointed meaning that maybe some parents need to learn and accept that their children aren't extensions of themselves, that kids are separate people with their own lives to live. The other panelists exchanged extremely worried glances with each other, their eyes wide with concern and fear about where this was going. One of them, her voice shaky and uncertain, tried desperately to jump in and change the subject to literally anything else. She suggested brightly, in a clearly forced, cheerful tone, that maybe they should move on to their next planned topic about holiday stress or something equally harmless. But it was absolutely too late. The damage had already been done, and both Tony and Denise were completely locked in combat now, neither willing to back down or admit any fault. Denise laughed in response to Tony's comment, but it absolutely wasn't a friendly laugh at all. It was cold, bitter, and sharp enough to cut glass. It was the kind of laugh that makes everyone in the room deeply uncomfortable. She said, dripping with sarcasm and contempt, that was really rich and hypocritical, coming from someone whose entire parenting advice and philosophy seemed to boil down to just leaving kids to sink or swim on their own, without any real guidance or protection. She asked, mockingly, in a condescending tone, if that's really the kind of harmful message he wanted to send out to thousands of parents watching at home who might actually take his advice seriously. Tony's entire face went bright red with anger. You could see the veins in his neck standing out. He leaned forward aggressively in his chair and said, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage, that he never once, not ever, said anything about leaving kids to sink or swim alone. He said that Denise was deliberately and maliciously twisting his words and taking them completely out of context to make him look bad in front of the audience and the viewers at home. He said it was crystal clear to him now that she had already made up her mind about him and his character before he even sat down in that chair. And this whole thing was nothing but an ambush, designed to make him look like a terrible parent on national television. The word ambush hung heavy in the air like a dark cloud. The audience was completely dead silent, barely breathing. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of this absolute train wreck, as everyone in that studio waited with bated breath to see what would possibly happen next in this rapidly escalating disaster. Denise fired back immediately, not missing a beat, that absolutely nobody ambushed him at all. She insisted that they were simply having an adult discussion and debate about parenting. And if he couldn't handle someone disagreeing with his precious parenting philosophy without getting all defensive and emotional, then maybe he shouldn't agree to come on talk shows where people might actually challenge his views. She said it all with this incredibly smug, self-satisfied look on her face, like she genuinely thought she'd completely won the argument and put him in his place, like she was proud of what was happening. That was it. That was the breaking point. Tony stood up from his chair, not quickly or frantically, but slowly and deliberately, with frightening calm. He looked down at Denise with an expression of pure disappointment and frustration, and said in a steady but furious voice that there's a massive difference between respectful disagreement and a personal attack, and that she had been relentlessly attacking him and his character from the absolute moment he gave his very first answer. He said he came on this show in good faith, expecting to have a respectful, mature conversation about parenting, not to be interrogated and judged about personal family decisions he made years ago that had nothing to do with anyone but his own family. Denise, clearly trying to regain some control of the rapidly deteriorating situation, told him sharply to sit back down immediately, reminding him that they were still in the middle of filming a live show. Her voice had this commanding, almost parental tone to it, like she was scolding a naughty child, like she expected him to just obey her and fall back in line. Tony slowly shook his head, his expression one of complete disgust and disappointment. He said firmly, "No, Denise. No. I don't think I will sit back down, actually." His voice was steady, but you could hear the anger simmering underneath every word. He continued, saying he'd been working in this industry for long enough, for decades, to know exactly when someone has it out for him, when someone is trying to tear him down. And he absolutely wasn't going to sit there for another second and be lectured about parenting and morality by someone who so clearly had a personal agenda against him from the very start. Another panelist, practically begging at this point, tried one more desperate time to calm the situation down and restore some peace. She said in a shaky, pleading voice that they were all just really passionate about the topic of parenting, that everyone gets emotional when talking about their children, and maybe they could all just take a breath and reset the conversation. But Tony wasn't listening anymore. He was completely done. His patience had run out entirely. He reached down with trembling hands and unclipped his microphone pack from his belt. his fingers fumbling slightly either from pure anger or adrenaline, or probably both coursing through his body. The sound of the clip releasing echoed through the silent studio like a gunshot. Denise, unwilling to let him have the last word, made one final cutting remark. She said with dripping condescension that walking off like this was pretty damn childish for someone who claims to teach his kids all about facing consequences and standing their ground. It was such a low blow, and absolutely everyone in that studio knew it. You could literally see the other panelists physically wince and cringe at the comment, knowing she'd gone way too far with that one. That was it. That was the absolute final straw that broke everything. Tony looked at Denise with pure, undisguised frustration and anger burning in his eyes and said loudly, "You know what, Denise? Screw this. I don't need to sit here and take this crap from you or anyone else." His voice echoed through the studio. He grabbed the microphone pack and dropped it on the desk with a loud, echoing thud that made several people jump. The sound reverberated through the entire space like thunder. He turned away from the panel and faced the shocked audience directly. He said, his voice softening just slightly with genuine regret, that he was truly sorry they had to witness this mess, that he came here today in completely good faith, hoping to have a normal, pleasant conversation about parenting. Then he looked back at the panel, his eyes scanning across all of them but landing firmly on Denise, and added pointedly that maybe some people on this panel should spend more time focusing on their own parenting choices and decisions instead of constantly judging and attacking everyone else's approaches just because they're different. Denise's mouth opened, clearly about to fire back with another response, but Tony was already moving. He was done talking. He turned on his heel and started walking off the set with determined, angry strides. His footsteps echoed loudly on the hard studio floor, each step sounding like a hammer blow in the absolute silence. The cameras followed his every single movement, capturing the obvious tension in his hunched shoulders, the rigid set of his jaw, and the absolutely determined look on his face that said there was no way anyone was changing his mind. One of the show's producers, a young woman with a clipboard, rushed over from the side of the set, her heels clicking frantically. She was probably panicking about the massive legal and PR nightmare this was rapidly becoming, probably thinking about contracts and obligations and the fallout this would create. She tried to physically stop Tony, reaching out to touch his arm, probably begging him to reconsider and come back to finish the segment properly. But Tony didn't even pause. He just firmly shook his head without looking at her and kept walking with that same determined pace. Nothing was going to stop him now. He pushed through the heavy studio door, shoving it open with force, and disappeared completely from view. The door swung shut behind him with a definitive slam that seemed to punctuate the entire horrible situation. He was gone. The panel was left sitting there in absolutely stunned silence, frozen in their seats like statues. Denise sat there rigidly with her arms crossed defensively over her chest, looking defiant and righteous, but also clearly rattled and shaken by what had just exploded in front of her. You could see her hands trembling slightly. The other panelists didn't know where to look or what to possibly say to recover from this. One of them stared down at the desk. Another looked toward the producers desperately for guidance. One of them finally suggested in an uncertain, wavering voice that maybe they should go to a commercial break right now, like immediately. Her voice cracked with stress. The last thing viewers at home saw before the screen finally, mercifully cut away, was that empty chair where Tony had been sitting just minutes before. His unused glass of water, still sitting on the desk, exactly where he'd left it. Condensation running down the sides, and the completely shocked, pale faces of everyone left behind, still trying desperately to process and comprehend what they'd all just witnessed happening right in front of them. The empty chair became a symbol of the entire disaster. The whole explosive confrontation had lasted barely just a few minutes from start to finish, but watching it unfold felt like an absolute eternity. Time seemed to slow down as the tension built and built. What started as a simple, straightforward discussion about parenting philosophies and approaches had exploded completely into a full-blown, no-holds-barred argument that ended with one of Britain's most respected, beloved, and admired actors walking off a live television show in front of millions of shocked viewers. The tension had built so incredibly quickly, escalating at lightning speed, that absolutely nobody in that studio or watching at home saw it coming until it was already far too late to stop it. The studio audience sat in deeply uncomfortable silence as the camera crew and producers scrambled frantically around them, trying desperately to figure out what to do next, how to salvage this complete disaster. Some viewers at home were probably cheering loudly for Tony standing his ground and refusing to be disrespected, calling him brave for walking away from such hostility. Others might have thought he overreacted to simple questions, that he should have stayed and defended his position more calmly. But one thing was absolutely certain and impossible to deny. Everyone who watched those intense few minutes would be talking about this shocking moment for a very long time to come. It would be replayed endlessly, analyzed to death, and debated passionately. Denise finally broke the heavy, oppressive silence by clearing her throat and saying in a shaky voice that they should probably try to explain to the viewers what just happened, why their guest had suddenly stormed off the set. But before she could possibly continue with whatever explanation or justification she was planning to offer, the director desperately cut to commercial, abruptly ending one of the most awkward, uncomfortable, and absolutely explosive segments in the entire history of Loose Women. The empty chair remained visible on screen for just one more second, a stark and powerful reminder of how incredibly quickly things had gone from friendly and cordial to absolutely hostile and destructive. This catastrophic interview wasn't supposed to go this way at all. Not even close. Tony Robinson was meant to be a completely safe, beloved guest who would charm the audience effortlessly with delightful stories about his long career and his family life. The producers probably thought it would be easy, pleasant content. Instead, he'd become an unwilling participant in one of the show's most controversial and talked about moments ever captured on camera. And it all came down to a fundamental, irreconcilable clash between him and Denise over something as deeply personal and emotional as how to properly raise children. Two completely different philosophies colliding head-on with explosive results. The worst, most frustrating part was that neither of them was necessarily completely wrong in their parenting beliefs and approaches. They just had completely different, incompatible styles and worldviews, and instead of respectfully acknowledging and respecting that difference like mature adults, the conversation had rapidly devolved into bitter personal attacks, harsh judgment, and a refusal to see the other person's perspective at all. What could have been a fascinating, nuanced discussion, exploring various legitimate parenting styles and their merits instead became a hostile battleground where both sides dug their heels in deep and refused to give even an inch of ground. As Tony pushed through those studio doors with such force and determination, he left behind much more than just an uncomfortable panel of hosts. He left behind a moment that would be replayed over and over, analyzed frame by frame, and argued about passionately for weeks and probably months to come. People would take sides immediately and argue ferociously, some defending his absolute right to walk away from such a hostile, disrespectful environment where he was being attacked. Others would criticize him harshly for not being able to handle a difficult conversation like an adult, for giving up and running away instead of standing his ground and defending his beliefs more articulately. But in that specific moment, as the door swung shut behind him with that definitive slam, Tony Robinson had made his choice crystal clear. He decided firmly that his personal dignity and his fundamental right to not be attacked and humiliated on national television were more important than finishing the segment or maintaining appearances. Whether people watching at home agreed with that difficult choice or not, whether they supported him or condemned him, it was absolutely impossible to deny that it made for incredibly gripping, compelling television that nobody could look away from. The panelists left behind on that stage had to somehow figure out how to continue the show and fill the remaining time, but the entire energy had completely shifted to something dark and uncomfortable. How do you possibly recover from watching a guest storm off your set in fury? How do you explain to confused viewers what they just saw when you're still desperately trying to process it yourself and figure out where everything went so wrong? These were the impossible questions facing Denise and the rest of the Loose Women panel as they prepared nervously to come back from the commercial break and face the audience again. Meanwhile, Tony was presumably making his way quickly out of the building, probably still absolutely furious, definitely not regretting his decision to leave for even a second. Because sometimes, standing up for yourself and protecting your dignity means walking away from a toxic situation, even if it means becoming the center of an enormous media firestorm and controversy. And that's exactly what Tony Robinson chose to do when he'd finally had enough of Denise Welch's relentless questioning, judgment, and attacks on his character and parenting. The empty chair, the dramatically dropped microphone, the heavy shocked silence, the slam of the door. These powerful images would forever define this particular episode of Loose Women in people's memories. It was raw, it was painfully real, and it was extremely uncomfortable to watch unfold. But that's exactly what happens when two strong, stubborn personalities clash intensely over something they both feel deeply passionate about. Neither person wanted to back down even slightly. Neither wanted to admit the other might possibly have a valid point worth considering. And in the end, someone had to make the choice to walk away from the conflict. That someone was Tony Robinson, and his dramatic, defiant exit from the Loose Women set after that absolutely fiery altercation with Denise Welch will go down in history as one of the most memorable, shocking, and endlessly discussed moments in the show's long history. It proved beyond any doubt that even the most seemingly friendly, innocent interviews can turn explosive in mere seconds when the wrong sensitive buttons get pushed repeatedly, and that sometimes the most powerful, dignified thing you can possibly do is simply refuse to participate in your own humiliation anymore.